Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by Erica Hirshler, John Singer Sargent's Jewish Sitters. This talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition, The Sassoons, on view at the Jewish Museum through August 13th, 2023. We encourage you to visit if you are able to do so. Now I would like to introduce our speaker. Erica Hirshler is Croll Senior Curator of American Paintings at the MFA Boston. An expert in late 19th and early 20th century painting, she has published extensively on American Impressionism, John Singer Sargent, Mary Cassatt, and women artists and collectors, with a particular interest in artistic exchange between the United States, Europe, and issues of national identity. She also studies Boston's art, history, and patronage. Hirshler holds a BA from Wellesley College and an MA and PhD from Boston University, and serves on the board of directors for the Terra Foundation of American Art. Her next exhibition, an interdisciplinary project exploring John Singer Sargent, fashion, and the construction of character, will open at the MFA Boston in the fall of 2023. It is my pleasure to welcome her to begin this talk.
Thank you, and thanks to the Jewish Museum for inviting me to speak about Sargent's Portraits of Jewish Sitters. It's one of the highlights for me of the current insightful exhibition about the Sassoon family. And I want to give my thanks to Claudia and to Esther, to Jenna, Rachel, and Teresa especially. As you can see from these two examples, Sargent's Portraits of Jewish Sitters are among his finest works. They have also been among the most controversial, greeted by critics of the day with anti-Semitic commentary, and often perceived by scholars and viewers in our own time as feeding into the racialized stereotypes that feed into anti-Semitism. But do they really? On the left is a quintessential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant sitter, Henry Cabot Lodge from 1890, and on the right, Asher Wertheimer from 1898. Before we look at the paintings, the sitters, and how the portraits were received, I thought it would be helpful to give you a bit of background into Sargent's career so you can see where he was in his artistic trajectory when these works were painted. Sargent's background was far from that of his many sitters, both the aristocratic British ones and the Jewish families we'll study in a moment. He was from a distinguished New England lineage. His parents were American. His father, Fitzwilliam, was a physician, and his mother, Mary Newbold Singer, was from a prominent Philadelphia family. Mr. and Mrs. Sargent had been abroad since 1854 to regain their health and their spirits after the loss of a child. And as my friend, the Sargent scholar Richard Ormond has put it, they forgot to go home. Sargent was born 2 years later in Florence, and you see two images of him here, one from 1883 on the left and a self-portrait from 1906 on the right. As I said, born in Florence and therefore always an international figure. As a boy, Sargent had shown great aptitude for drawing and painting, and in 1873, he began his formal training at the Academy in Florence. By 1874, he had convinced his family that Paris was the only place to study art, and they all moved to Paris so Sargent could pursue his artistic education. He enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, which you see on the left, which gave him a firm grounding in the academic tradition, which depended on drawing, such as the early study of a dancing faun that you see at lower left. He also took classes from the stylish French portraitist Carolus Duran, whose photograph you see at upper right, and whose famous portrait, La Dame aux Gants, Woman with Gloves, you see at lower right. Carolus gave him a firm background in painting alla prima, or without detailed pencil studies, but instead painting right on the canvas. Sargent was very much at home in Paris. His family was there, and he was completely fluent in French. as well as German and Italian. He first exhibited at the prestigious Paris Salon in 1877, announcing himself as a painter to be reckoned with. Here is his portrait of his teacher, Carolus Duran, which he displayed in 1879. It's inscribed to my dear master, but in a way, it's really a declaration of independence. And he started to get many portrait commissions, some even that might have gone to Carolus himself, including this beautiful 1880 portrait of Madame Ramon Subercaseaux, the wife of the Chilean ambassador to Paris. It's beautiful and stylish and very much of the moment. But Sargent had a very savvy exhibition strategy, and he always reminded his audience that he wasn't just a portrait painter by interspersing his displays of portraits with knockouts like this, El Jaleo from 1882, now at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. It was well received. It was the most talked about picture in Paris. It was noisy, dramatic, and exotic. He followed it up the next year with another triumph, a different kind of painting, always demonstrating the range of his talents. Now he shows his commitment to painting modern life, 4 ordinary girls and a Paris apartment, turned into a painting that's simply extraordinary. It's a portrait that's a great deal more than a portrait. And it was inspired on the one hand by Velázquez, whose Las Meninas Sargent had copied in 1879, and on the other hand by modern painters like Degas, whose Place de la Concorde from 1876 you see at lower right, with its stage-like use of centrifugal space and the disconnection of each of the figures. Sargent had received sufficient recognition and new commissions to take on a larger studio in a fashionable new neighborhood in Paris, and he took on a very fashionable sitter. Here you see Madame X from 1884, now in the Metropolitan. Madame X was Virginie Avegno-Gautreau, an American woman from New Orleans who moved to Paris with her mother after her father died during the Civil War. She married a Parisian banker and was known as a celebrated and self-conscious belle. Sargent met her late in 1882 and became obsessed with her and finally convinced her to let him paint her portrait. It was not a commission. Sargent wasn't the only one. Everybody was transfixed by Madame X. The American painter Edward Simmons, who was then a student in Paris, described her. And he said she was, and I quote, black as spades and white as milk. Something about her gave you the impression of infinite proportion, infinite grace, and infinite balance. Every artist wanted to make her in marble or in paint. Sargent's finished product, which you see here in a wood engraving at upper left with one strap down, showed Madame Gautreau as she wished to be seen. Sophisticated, perfectly groomed, elegantly dressed, urban and independent. She loved it. The letter at center describes her reporting to a friend, Sargent has made a masterpiece. But she didn't love it after it was put on display at the 1884 Salon, where it was savaged by critics, as you can see in the cartoon at lower right. The painting, one artist reported, was surrounded by shoals of astonished and jibing women. One reporter wrote in the press, of all the ladies in undress, the only one of interest is Sargent's, interesting for its attention to the fine profile, reminiscent of Piero della Francesca, interesting for its décolletage and its chains of silver, which are indecent and give the impression that they are about to fall down. Interesting for the powder that makes her skin cadaverous and clownish at the same time. Many viewers professed to be shocked, and Sargent was taken off guard. His potential French commissions evaporated. I'm telling you this story because I want you to keep in mind that the artist's intentions for a painting are only one part of its history, and the picture's public reception is quite another, and they don't always align. We'll look at that again in a few moments. Well, it took Sargent a while to recover from this episode, and with his friends Henry James's encouragement, he had already begun to think about moving to England, where he had a few portrait commissions already in hand, notably a suite of portraits for the Vickers family, who were arms manufacturers in Sheffield. You see here the Mrs. Vickers from 1884. But aside from the Vickers commission, he had a few other offers. And in England, when this portrait was shown, it was described as beastly French. Later that year, Sargent sharpened his landscape technique and explored Impressionist light effects, joining a group of American and British painters in the English countryside at Broadway in the Cotswolds. And there he reinvented himself as an English painter, reaching a remarkable level of success with Carnation Lily, Lily Rose, which you see here from 1885. It established his early reputation in England. It translated his French style into an English one, connecting his work with contemporary British taste, a balance between Impressionism with its concern for transient light effects and English garden painting. The title comes from a popular song. The painting was bought for the nation through the Chantry bequest and presented to the Tate in 1887. But portrait commissions were slow in coming. And the next year, in the fall of 1887, Sargent came to the United States and there regained his footing as a portraitist, as you can see with these three examples: Mrs. Charles Inches on the left, Isabella Stewart Gardner at center, and Mrs. Elizabeth Marquand at the right. They show the gamut that he painted during his American trip: young society women like Mrs. Inches, important matrons like Mrs. Marquand, and well-known figures like Mrs. Gardner, who had visited Sargent in London specifically to see Madame X. Clearly, she wanted something similarly dramatic. Henry James called her portrait a Byzantine icon with a halo. Sargent came back to London flush with his American triumph, and his studio on Tite Street in Chelsea would soon become Portrait Central and the site of his English portrait success. On his return, he reinvented himself as a British portraitist as well, and his portrait of Gertrude Vernon, Lady Agnew, a beguiling, haunting beauty in delicate health, would confirm his reputation as a portraitist in Britain. He used English painting for his pictorial inspiration, adopting the poetic half-length portraits of women by Sir Joshua Reynolds, such as the one at upper right, and by Henry Raeburn, Mrs. Andrew Hay at lower right, modifying these for the modern moment. He positioned both his sitters and his paintings as successors to a beloved national tradition, and all London fell at his feet. Soon he could barely keep up with the demand for his portraits, and he became the most sought-after portraitist on both sides of the Atlantic. The great French sculptor Auguste Rodin dubbed him the Van Dyck of our times. So many aristocratic portraits were in demand that Sargent's friend, the satirist Max Beerbohm, could make fun of the duchesses and their footmen who lined up outside Sargent's studio while the artist looked nervously out the window behind him. He was in constant demand from the most upper crust British aristocrats, Mrs. Lord Dalhousie on the left from 1900. You can see why he was so successful. These portraits would join the ancestors by Van Dyck and Reynolds in the great houses of Britain. And you can see how Sargent took the pose of one of the Stewart brothers in this great Van Dyck portrait in the National Gallery in London on the right. He combined these old master references with a distinctly modern sensibility. These portraits became more and more elaborate, reaching an apogee in this one of Charles, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, with his American wife, Consuelo Vanderbilt, and their two sons, the heir and the spare. It's a story that's straight out of Edith Wharton. She married for social position. He married her for her money. It was not a happy union, and eventually they divorced. The Marlborough portrait, though, is still at Blenheim, which you can see the great palace at upper right. And it allows us still to appreciate the direct connection between these sitters and their heritage. Sargent's portrait at the left was meant to complement a portrait of the Marlborough family by John Singleton Copley, which you see here at lower right. They both hang in the great red room that you see at center right. These portraits are interesting art historically, and they're often done with passages of great beauty, but one can't think that they provided Sargent with much artistic freedom. The genre was too tightly controlled. And with commissions such as these, one after the other, it's a bit easier to understand why Sargent began to hate painting portraits, giving them up almost entirely by 1907. Now, with this trajectory in mind, let's step back in time and take a look at where Sargent's portraits of Jewish sitters fall into the sequence. There are early and long-lasting friendships with Jewish individuals in Paris, August Hirsch for one. And you see on the left a drawing by another artist of Sargent in his studio. He shared that studio with August Hirsch, who is an academic painter. I'm showing you his woman in Oriental dress at the lower center. And they shared the studio for many years, and Hirsch acquired many early works by Sargent. Sargent was also lifelong friends with Georg Henschel, who became the first conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Although they had met earlier, this is his portrait, Sargent's portrait of Henschel from 1889, and they remained friends throughout the rest of their lives. But the best known and finest commissions of Jewish sitters come in the 1890s, after Sargent had established himself as the London portraitist of choice. Many of you will have seen this one at the Jewish Museum, Mrs. Carl Meyer and Her Children from 1896, from the collection of Tate Britain. Adele Meyer, née Levy, her father was a rubber manufacturer, lived from 1861 to 1930, and she's shown with her daughter Elsie Charlotte and her son Frank Cecil. Her husband, Carl Meyer, was a banker, a foreign emissary of the Rothschilds, and a chairman of De Beers, as well as director of the National Bank of Egypt. He was also a patron of the arts and a big donor to the Royal Shakespeare Festival Theatre in Stratford. Adele was a flamboyant hostess, passionate about the arts, particularly theater, music, and opera, something she shared with Sargent, which infused their sittings and their conversations with enthusiasm. Adele was also an activist involved in improving the lives of women in the textile industry, which one can think of when one looks at the great swath of her pink satin skirt. Sargent made this into a very theatrical composition with its plunging perspective, which captures Adele's expansive personality. By using props in his Tite Street studio, including the wood paneling and the Louis XV sofa, Sargent created an image of opulence and unapologetic wealth that reflect the status of Adele Meyer in society. Everything speaks of abundance, from the long strings of pearls to the swath of peach-colored satin. It's an age of the Rococo revival, and one might have even think of the great paintings of the 18th century, like this Boucher portrait of Madame de Pompadour, as a source of inspiration for Sargent. It also very much reflects the Meyers' own taste, which is in keeping with the taste of the British upper classes. They loved the portrait, and you can see it here hanging in their dining room at Short Grove Hall, which you see at upper right, and a family portrait at lower left. Sargent's portrait was well received when it was shown in London, Paris, and Boston. It was honored with a caricature in Punch that teased it as a, quote, sliding scale, a tobogganing exercise, because of its steep perspective, and the children in the cartoon hang on to their mother so that she doesn't slide right out of the frame. Henry James wrote, "Of all these elements, Mr. Sargent has made a picture of knockdown insolence of talent and truth of characterization, a wonderful rendering of life, of manners, of aspects, of types, of textures, of everything." Now, here's where the situation gets a little bit more complex. For just as the painting received critical acclaim for its artistry, it also attracted comments that centered on the fact of its Jewish subjects. Some comments, inappropriate to us today, were in fact par for the course in the late 19th century. And let me put that difficulty on the table right away, that history doesn't always live up to contemporary standards. We see it today in arguments over productions of the Mikado or Madame Butterfly, for example, or with the display of images or sculptures, or even the names of individuals who earned their fortunes in nefarious ways. As far as the Meyers go, there had been a long history of associating Jews with the East, with the exotic, with the sensual. Henry James, in his favorable review, described the Meyers children as, and I quote, "Jewish to a quaint Orientalism, faces to peep out of the lattice, or the curtains of the closed seraglio, or the pelican." A more conservative journal, The Spectator, remarked that Sargent had not succeeded in making attractive these, quote, "over-civilized European Orientals." There are clear aspects here of anti-Semitism, but also of British nationalism, of a fear that foreigners were taking over jolly old England, not only Jews, but other immigrants, Europeans and Americans, in a tale that sounds familiar to us today, alas. There's also a class distinction here, new money versus the old aristocratic land-owning wealth. It's a complicated stew. The Meyers were hardly Sargent's only Jewish sitters. Among Sargent's many London patrons were a number of bankers and their wives. On the left, you see Matilda Hirsch. Her German-born father had become a wealthy financier in New York, and he moved to London to manage the London branch of Seligman Brothers. She was Matilda Seligman. She married Leopold Hirsch, also a banker and an important collector of paintings and decorative arts. She's dressed with antique textiles, an old damask and an old lace, referring to her husband and her own collecting interests. But there's also a reference to Velázquez. You might recognize this portrait of Philip IV from the Frick Museum in New York, but there was another version of it, now considered a copy, in London at Dulwich from 1811. And there are three portraits of wives of the Raphael family cousins. Mrs. Lewis Raphael, Henriette Goldschmidt on your left, now in Montgomery, Mrs. George Raphael from 1906 at center, and Mrs. Ernest Raphael from 1905 at the upper right. Henriette Goldschmidt Raphael on the left was the wife of Louis Raphael, who was the director of the private bank, Raphael's, which had been founded in 1787 by Sephardic Jewish financiers who'd left Portugal to escape persecution. The bank had branches in several European cities, but the London branch was the most prosperous. The bank still exists, although no longer with family ties. Margareta Raphael at the top right employs the same formula as Lady Agnew in the same kind of 18th century bergère chair. And Flora Sassoon Raphael at the center is the earliest of the set. She's posed in an elaborate French Empire chair in Sargent's studio. And behind her is the same small statuette that we see on the mantelpiece in Henriette's portrait, just at her elbow. These paintings were all set in Sargent's Tite Street studio, number 30 on Tite Street. We recognize the mantelpiece and the mirror in other portraits, as well as that sculpture, which belonged to Sargent and which represents Venus, the goddess of beauty. And Henriette is indeed lovely in her ice blue dress and satin wrap. I'm showing you the sculpture itself at the center, along with a view of Sargent's Tite Street studio, where you can make out the mantelpiece at the right. And you can see that the pose of Henriette's portrait is the equivalent, if much more beautiful, to portraits made of non-Jewish sitters. William Crowninshield Endicott at lower right from 1907, a Boston lawyer and historian, or Dora Tomlinson at lower center, the wife of a New York lawyer. And Sargent made Henriette Raphael even more beautiful by comparing her in our imaginations with one of the era's most well-known images of beauty, Ingres' portrait of the Comtesse d'Aussonville. You can imagine how many people wanted portraits that looked like this. And when modest Mr. Endicott was posing for Sargent next to that mantelpiece at Tite Street, his wife happened to note in her diary that the London papers were full of praise for another Sargent portrait, another masterpiece, this one, Aline de Rothschild, the Baroness Sassoon from 1907. This sitter, Lady Sassoon, represented the merger of two of London's greatest Jewish banking families. Aline de Rothschild married Edward Albert Sassoon in 1887. Aline was a pastelist and a society hostess. She was an intellectual and close to Sargent, who also befriended and painted her two children, as we see so beautifully demonstrated in the Jewish Museum exhibition. Aline in this portrait is wearing a black taffeta opera cloak lined with pink silk and a large feathered hat. She's very stylish, but she also takes on the swagger of a cavalier painted by the old masters. This is a swagger portrait and also one of delicate refinement. When the painting was exhibited, the reviewer for The Spectator said, "Mr. Sargent has found a sitter who could arouse his powers." But some people complained about Sargent's very bravura, that he was showing off to a bewildering degree, although in general the painting was warmly perceived. This demonstration of Sargent's mastery falls at the very end of his professional career as a portraitist. As I said, after 1907, he accepted very few commissions, usually when he felt he had absolutely no choice, or he restricted himself to making oil portraits of friends. And his relationship with the Sassoons falls into that category. And in 1913, he painted Aline's daughter, Sybil, and in 1923, her son, Philip. And like their mother, they were both good friends of Sargent's. Sybil had known Sargent since childhood, and this painting was made as a wedding gift when she married the Earl of Rock-Savage in 1913, later becoming the Marchioness of Cholmondeley when her husband inherited the title. She was a great champion of the family seat of Houghton Hall in Norfolk, one of the grandest of estates, for which she planned an ambitious and award-winning restoration. Sargent's portrait is very much based on 17th century British aristocratic portraiture, as is evident in this comparison of Peter Lely's Mary of Modena when she was Duchess of York from 1675 in the Royal Collections. He places Sybil as the new member of the family within the artistic context of the British aristocracy, just as Sybil herself became part of its actual social context. And I'm showing you at left a photograph I took of the portrait of Sybil Sassoon in the room at Houghton Hall, where it's joined by other aristocratic British portraits. But there's very much also a sentimental gesture here related to the friendship between Sybil Sassoon and John Sargent. Sargent had painted this likeness of his beloved niece Rosemary the year before, which you can see on the right, wrapped in the same cashmere shawl. And he later gave that shawl, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, to Sybil. He painted Sybil again in the 1920s in a costume dress that Sargent ordered from Worth, based on a portrait of Queen Anna of Austria by Antonis Moore, a copy of which was in the Prado. And you can see that Sybil wears the wonderful Habsburg jewel that appears also in the 17th century portrait. And Sargent also painted Sybil's brother Philip in 1923. Philip Sassoon, a politician, a connoisseur, and a close friend of the artist. Philip Sassoon served in Parliament and he inherited a fortune. He was a trustee of the National Gallery and chairman of its board from 1932 to 36. He was involved with the Tate Gallery, the Wallace Collection, and the British School at Rome. He also collected Sargent's work, which he displayed in a dedicated room in his London house. Philip was a man of fastidious taste, frequently described as a dandy, and Sargent captured him perfectly, as you can see in this comparison with a photo of Philip. And it's an even closer comparison when you know that Sargent had originally included his right hand in the portrait, then later editing it out by cutting it from the canvas. Once again, though, the shadow of the East was cast upon this portrait. The novelist E.M. Forster wrote that he found himself standing next to Sassoon when viewing Sargent's portrait at the Royal Academy in 1926. Forster describes Sassoon as, and I quote, a young Oriental, subtle and charming, and not quite sure of his ground, despite very horsey, impeccably cut tweeds. I complimented him in flowery words. He winced. He disclaimed all knowledge of the East. I'd like to close our time together by looking at Sargent's most significant group of portraits of Jewish sitters, the Wertheimer family, when we can all think back on the time they were displayed at the Jewish Museum, and we can all look forward to Jean Strauss's forthcoming book about the family. Asher Wertheimer, who I showed at the beginning of this lecture, lived from 1844 to 1918. He was born in London, and his career was a fine art dealer with premises at 158 New Bond Street. He specialized in French furniture and decorative arts, in Dutch and Flemish old masters, and among his clients were both the Rothschilds and Sir Richard Wallace. He commissioned this pair of portraits to celebrate his silver wedding anniversary in 1898, Asher on the left and his wife Flora on the right. Asher is accompanied by his black poodle, Noble. Flora Joseph Wertheimer on the right was the daughter of another antique dealer, Edward Joseph, and Sargent shows her in white satin bedecked with pearls and diamonds. Both of these were made at Tite Street, although Mrs. Wertheimer's Rococo table seems to have been imported from the occasion. They were displayed together in 1898 at the Royal Academy, where they were highly admired, described as a masterpiece, one journal declaring, "Happy is the man whose portrait has been painted thus." But again, there's a difference between what people took from the painting itself and the preconceptions they brought to it, often embellishing their own remarks with anti-Semitic commentary. Isaac Phelps Stokes, a New York architect who had also been painted by Sargent, he was a voice for housing reform, saw the paintings in Sargent's studio, and he remarked that it looked as if Wertheimer were, quote, pleasantly engaged in counting shekels. The cartoon in Punch, which you see here at lower right, was even worse, using contemporary dialect associated with moneylenders. And the caption reads, "What? Only this monish for that splendid dog? My dear, it's ridiculous." Many have also found the likeness itself to be anti-Semitic, playing into stereotypes about Jewish physiognomy. And I show you here a photograph of Wertheimer. But it seems doubtful that Wertheimer saw it that way. He and Sargent became good friends, and Wertheimer gave Sargent the largest private commission that he would undertake during his lifetime, a series of 12 portraits of the Wertheimer family, commissioned after these first portraits in 1898 and not completed until 1908. In fact, Sargent described himself as being in a state of chronic Wertheimerism. He painted 4 of the 10 Wertheimer children in 1901. This is Alfred, the second eldest son of Asher and Flora, a chemist by trade, hence the 2 chemical flasks hanging in the left-hand background as attributes. And here are 3 of their daughters, Hilda on the left, the 3rd daughter, shown in the manner of the Grand Masters. Sargent had tried to dissuade her from wearing her pince-nez spectacles, which undermine this illusion of the past, but they were retained at her insistence. On the right, one of Sargent's most beautiful portraits of Helena, Ina, and Elizabeth, Betty Wertheimer. Sargent was attracted by the charm of the entire family, but especially the vivacity of Ina on the right, wearing white, something that is clearly revealed in this portrait. The different textures of the sitters' dresses are skillfully evoked, the rich depth of Betty's red velvet contrasting with the shine of Ina's white damask. The painting was highly admired for its vivid, active sensibility. In 1902, in Paris, Sargent began to paint Edward Wertheimer, the eldest of Asher's 4 sons, who was the only one to take an active interest in his father's profession as an art dealer, although he never actually participated in the running of his father's business. He was a linguist and a musician, and this portrait, as you may have gathered, was left unfinished, interrupted by the death of the sitter that same year, 1902. Also in 1902, Sargent painted 3 of the youngest Wertheimer children in the schoolroom of their house at 8 Connaught Place in London. Essie, aged 22, is presented as an adult, seated slightly detached on the sofa with a small dog in her lap. Her younger siblings, Ruby, aged 12, and Ferdinand, 13, lean more informally across an ottoman. Despite the naturalness of the grouping, certain critics disliked the atmosphere of privilege that they saw in this painting. The Spectator said, and I quote, "Here the pet dogs are bedecked with bows, and the air we feel smells of scent and burnt pastilles." Well, then something unusual happened. After painting 10 members of the Wertheimer family, Sargent continued the project, and he started to paint some of them over again. Mrs. Wertheimer had never been entirely satisfied with her 1898 portrait, perhaps because it didn't seem to be a balanced pair with that of her husband, and Sargent, too, seemed unhappy with his first attempt, perhaps when he got to know her better, and he painted a second portrait of her in 1904 with a darker palette and a more serious demeanor. And here's Hilda again, now with her siblings Almina and Conway. The stone terrace and the urn in the background recall the style of 18th century portraiture, designed to confirm aristocratic status. The riding habit and crop worn by Almina on the right, and the spaniel with Conway in the center also refer to aristocratic pursuits and portraits. And here's Betty again in another splendid red dress, posed as if she were in a Gainsborough portrait. And here is Ina again in a new portrait created to honor her marriage to Robert Moritz Matthias in 1905. The work's title, Avec les Gonfiers, is an Italian phrase that translates as "in full sail." During the period that Ina spent sitting for the work, she reportedly arrived at Sargent's studio each time complaining about the length of time it was taking him to paint her. The energy with which she did so appealed to him so much that he decided to focus his likeness on her billowing liveliness. The outfit is unconventional for a woman. She seems to have picked up the garments that were left in Sargent's studio where they were awaiting another portrait, one of an aristocratic and titled man. And to add to the illusion of motion, Sargent asked Ina to hold a broomstick underneath her cloak while he painted her. And this object can be seen protruding from under the cloth at the right-hand edge of the composition. And most viewers read it as a sword to go with this rather swashbuckling, gender-bending image. The dynamism of the portrait also reveals Sargent's enjoyment of Ina's company, her interest in the arts, her life and her movement, which he found so much more attractive than the pale reserve of many of his British women sitters. And here is Almina again, Asher Wertheimer's fifth daughter. She's shown in a deliberately exotic Oriental costume. And what does that mean? I have to confess this is one of my favorites of the Wertheimer portraits, maybe because it's such a complicated one, redolent of that hint of the sensual East that was so often ascribed to Jewish sitters. The white overjacket with green motifs was actually a studio prop. It's a Turkish antari, a long open robe that was one of a number of non-Western garments that Sargent had picked up on his travels and used in his art. And you see Sargent's niece, Rosemary, wearing it here in the photograph on the right. It's the same jacket. And we also see it here in a number of figurative compositions that Sargent made in the Alps at just the same time. He had recently returned from his travels to the Near East that were done in connection with his mural cycles for the Boston Public Library. And with the costumes he'd acquired on his trip, he played dress up with everyone. The two paintings on the right, the brook at the top and the chess game at lower right, show his nieces, Rosemary and Wren. There's a very long tradition of dress up, particularly in Turkish garb from the 18th century, much of it based on Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's travels in Turkey during the 18th century, which she wrote up in an extremely popular book that caused many women in the 18th century to adopt Turkish attire. You see the book on the left, which was published in 1763, but you can already see in 1730 at upper right, Elizabeth Howard in Turkery in a painting by the British artist George Knapton. Or closer to home, perhaps, John Singleton Copley's view of Mrs. Joseph Barrell of Boston from 1771 in a similar Turkish robe. It keeps going. On the left, you see the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria dressed for a masquerade, wearing, again, Turkish robes. And on the right, the Duchess of Devonshire as Queen Zenobia at her very popular 1897 masquerade costume ball. Well, dressing up in another culture's clothing is no longer as acceptable to people today as it was in Sargent's day, which complicates, I think, our efforts to understand Almina's portrait. It might be read as equating Jewish women with the sexualized fantasies that were ascribed and applied to women from the Middle East in photographs like the one at upper right, a harem beauty from the collection at the Library of Congress, or at the right, a painting from the 1870s by a French artist showing a Turkish woman with her breast exposed. But I have to say I was very taken when I discovered this photograph of Rachel Sassoon in the context of your exhibition. Rachel Sassoon, editor of The Observer and of the Sunday Times, who is clearly here costuming herself in Turkish garb for the camera. What does this dress up mean to in Sargent's day, and in particular to Jewish women in Sargent's day? There's also an art historical precedent, something that would have mattered to Sargent, as we've seen. As so many Sargent paintings do, this one also looks back to great works of art from the past, particularly the works of Delacroix, whose work you see at center. This one, a watercolor of Sada, the wife of Abraham ben Shmuel, and one of their daughters, which he made in several watercolors of Jewish family members he made in Algeria in the 1830s. Or at lower right, Renoir's portrait of another Jewish sitter, Rebecca Stora, this one made in Paris. She was originally from Algeria, and her Algerian origins might explain the costume that she wears at lower right in this 1870 portrait, but it also plays into all those stereotypes that we've mentioned before. Is that what Sargent was doing with Almina? Some people believe it, but I wonder. She seems so in on the joke. And as my colleague Caroline Corbeau-Parsons has just discovered in an article soon to be published, Sargent's portraits may also refer to a painting that had recently been stolen from Almina's uncle, a portrait by Joshua Reynolds, which you see here in a photograph on the right. Sargent was close to these families. They were friends. You see him here with the Wertheimers on the left and with the Sassoons on the right. And it's very hard to believe that he acted with ill intent, especially since these families continued to commission portraits from him. But as I've discussed, portraits become avatars for the people that they represent, and they often bear witness to the prejudices of the day. Well, in the end, Wertheimer triumphed. In 1916, Asher Wertheimer announced that he was bequeathing his Sargent portraits to the National Collections in London for the benefit of the nation. 9 of them came to the National Gallery in 1922, following Mrs. Wertheimer's death. The gift was controversial for reasons both artistic and social. The National Gallery, as a rule, did not take works of art by living artists, although some exceptions were made. And the cartoon that was published in Punch at Center in 1923 refers to that. The young master, it's captioned, and underneath it says, "You're the first master to break the rule and get in here alive." As you can see, Sargent is greeted by Velázquez, Rembrandt, and other famous artists. But both the painter and the sitters were thought somehow to have entered the canon unfairly. And I'm afraid it wasn't until 2022 that the Tate displayed all of the Wertheimer portraits together again in the manner that Asher Wertheimer had intended. But I hope you'll agree that these portraits are among Sargent's most interesting and most beautiful works, and perhaps you'll come see them again in a forthcoming exhibition fashioned by Sargent, which will open at the MFA Boston in October of this year. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.